In this video, we're going to be using the automation playground to prove why testing in Playwright is so awesome. We're going to run through multiple test cases to get you started writing automation so that you have a playbook to use to base off future tests. This video will be broken up into chapters, and you can see those across the bottom, but there's also going to be links in the description below, so if any of the pages you see on the screen are interesting, you should check those out in the links below. To get started here with the documentation, here for Playwright for Python, a link in the description, you can see the installation is pretty easy. We're going to do pip install PyTest Playwright. Brand new folder here with nothing in it, and run that. So I already have everything installed, or else it would install everything for you. And then what you would have to run is Playwright install, and that would install all the browsers for you. The first thing I'm going to do is create a file, and I'm just going to, and then I'm going to just go back over the documentation quick and grab this example test. So we just paste this test in, and then I'm going to run PyTest, and no items were collected. So it's really important that you have underscore test, because Python won't find those by convention. But once you have something underscore test, PyTest will find that, it'll have its cache, and then you can see here it's even run this test right away. We got one green dot, meaning our test works. Just to show you, if we just copy and paste this test here and change the name really quick so it's found twice, we'll get 2 dots from Playwright showing that 2 tests have passed. So it's running these headlessly by default. We can show that it works if you run PyTest and then -- headful, and then now this time it'll open the Chrome browser twice and navigate to that page. Instead of running in Chrome, if we want to run in Firefox, we can still do headful, then do browser Firefox. I'll caution you that Firefox does run slower, but we'll see that 2 Firefox browsers will pop up this time rather than Chrome. And this is the cool thing about Playwright, is that you can switch browsers or run multiple browsers, and the tests just work the same in every browser. We're going to get rid of this second test here. And before, I told you that PyTest requires underscore test here for a test file to be found. Similarly, in our definitions here, if it doesn't start with test underscore, it's not going to get picked up as a test. So you want to make sure everything starts with test underscore when we write our tests. So we started with the sample test just to prove that PyTest we have the name of our test here that's passing in a page object that's provided by PyTest, and then it's using that page to go to an example website. It's using an assert to prove that something actually exists on that page. Here it's looking for a title called example domain. Then the page object to click on something, a text object that says more information. This is really what our tests are going to start looking like. This test automation playground is really cool because it uses different automation pitfalls appearing in modern web applications, and then they're emulated below. So if you look here, there's things like load delays, where this is historically hard to do in Selenium. You can see this loading, waiting. In Selenium, you have to do a lot of things to wait for that. It's going to be super easy in Playwright. And then there's some other ones we're going to go through, like this sample app here, where you can go through a login, and it doesn't really matter what we put here, but as long as we put PWD as the password, you can see that here. We'll get a welcome login message, and we'll be able to assert that those things will work. So that's some of the stuff coming up. But first, let's start out with a really simple test. Let's start out with like a basic click test. So I'm going to grab this URL, and I'm just going to paste it into our go-to. So we're going to start testing on this page. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to click on something like this click text. So I'm going to remove this assertion here, and we want to click text that says click, and I'm just going to click in here, and now there's a button here. I'm going to hit F12 to pull to DevTools, figure out what this button has on it, and this has an ID of bad button, so we're going to use that. So I'm just going to do page.click, and then the hashtag bad button is the ID. All right, so we now have another test here We're going to just call this a test click, because all we're really doing is clicking here, and then we're using a couple different selectors. We'll talk more about these in just a second. But if I go ahead and run PyTest, I'll just run a headful here just for this one time. You can see we navigate through the click page. I found that item, and then it worked. I know it found the item because it got a green dot. If we go over here and change this and try this again, it's not going to be able to click on the ID because it doesn't exist. So now it's waiting for that element to exist on the page. This is one of the real cool things about Playwright, is that it will wait for elements to stop moving, to be visible, to become visible, and it'll do all these necessary waits for you without you having to code a bunch of stuff to do that. You just kind of get that by default, but eventually here it's going to time out, and then we'll get a red mark saying that the test didn't pass. So you can see here that when you have an error like that, you get what line errored. You can see, you kind of see a stack trace. Doesn't really help you too much, but what selector and stuff was throwing the problem. So that can be helpful. We knew it was going to happen here, but you can also see the default timeout's 30 seconds. So that's kind of cool, but we'll just go ahead and put this back as our first example. And we have two things that we're clicking on. One, it's a hyperlink that has a text of click, and the other one is this ID of bad button. So if we go back to our page really quick here, we're clicking on this hyperlink because that's the text that we found, and then we're clicking on this button, which is fine, but one of the things that you'll need to get used to if you're using a test automation tool like this is there's two types of selectors that Playwright uses. One is CSS selector, and these are CSS selectors here. So like this H1 div and these ULs. Normally these have attributes like this when you use them. So an ID is actually anything with a pound and then the value. A class is anything with a period then the value. You can do things to find like inputs, and this is just a really nice cheat sheet if you're looking for these. The only ones you'll probably use most of the time are like class, ID, and maybe this input type. And this could be any value. You have an element, and then you have an attribute inside the element that you want to check for. And these are XPaths. There's sometimes where it's easier to find something based on an XPath rather than a CSS selector. And you just know that these are available. What you can do, again, if we go back to the UI test playground and come over here, and so if I click on like this text input, you can see the elements here. But if I right click on this, you can do a copy, and so you have different options when you copy this. You can copy on selectors, you can copy on HTML, and then you can also copy on XPath. So if we copy on that XPath just to see what that grabs us, I'm just going to paste it in here. You can see that it pulls out this XPath. So if you have trouble finding a locator that's unique, you can use XPaths. It's not your preferred method most likely, but it is something that you can grab. So hopefully that's helpful. You definitely need to know what your selectors look like. So if this is confusing at all, that I'm looking for an ID here, take a look at that spreadsheet or look up CSS selectors, and that can give you more information about that. So just removing this test, we're going to jump to our next test here. And the next test we're going to do is we're going to do a test for load delay. So we're just going to type this out quickly. So we're going to go to this test playground again. So then the next thing we're going to do once we get there is we're going to go to the page and click on text load delay. And once we click on text load delay, this is really just demoing that Playwright will auto wait for us. Let me do this click here, and we're going to click on a class of button. So if we run this test now, and I'm going to run these again in a headful state. So the first one will go through the click test, and this next one you can see has clicked this load delay, and it's spinning down here, and that test passed because as soon as that delay was over, it automatically it finished and moved on to the next part that clicked on the button that's on that next page. In the Playwright documentation, you can see that there are multiple things that every action in Playwright is doing for you. So it's always making sure that the elements attached to the DOM, it's always visible, It's stable, not animating or doing any weird jittery stuff. It's able to receive events and not obscured by other elements, and it's also enabled. And you can see here that this works on check, click, double click, tap, uncheck, hover, screenshot, fill, which is for inputs, selecting text, and focus. So there's a whole bunch of stuff here, and then we also have these assertions that are available in the documentation. The other nice thing here is that in PyTest, besides this initial test here, you can see that here's our example with headed. Our browser Firefox, we're running multiple browsers here like Chromium and WebKit. And then there's also this other thing that we're going to set up in just a second, but you can do a PyTest ini file. And in this file, you can set all these parameters in so you don't have to keep tapping them at the command line over and over again. So if you wanted to run for all 3 browsers every time, you could basically create this pytest.ini file. And then when you run with these commands, it'll use those every time. So all you have to do is type PyTest, and then your test will run the same way every time. And we're going to create this PyTest.ini. We don't actually care about these parameters that we brought over. We want to add a different one here. What we want to add is base URL, because we're already starting to type this every time. So now every time we write our tests, we don't have to navigate to UI testing playground and then click on the same thing. We can just remove all that repeated code. So if we come back over to our tests here, if we want this test to work the same way, all we have to do is slash, and then it'll click on click and then bad button. And we just do the same thing for this one because that's our root page. So if we just rerun our test quick, and I need to move this off to the next line. We'll rerun this here. So it ran the second time fine. As soon as we moved that down, you can't have comments on the same line. Apparently it doesn't read them properly. But now we have less boilerplate up here. And the only difference now is that when we click here, this test takes a long time to run. So I'm just going to comment it out, but we'll have it available in case we need it later. That's the problem with these load delay tests, is that they take a long time. So the next test that we're going to do is we're going to test an input. If we come back to our UI test automation playground, the test we're going to do is this text input test. So this test is entering text into an edit field. And there's something on this page where it's supposed to make it hard to find this element. But basically we're going to grab this input, enter some text in here, click this button, and then the text is going to change to match whatever text we add here. So let's see how we're going to write that test. And I'm just going to grab this so I don't have to start 100% over. And we're going to start out with test input. And we're going to go to text input. And how I got this was, if you look at the page URL, you can see here is /text input. And since we don't have to repeat ourselves all the time, we can just start at that relative path. We're going to do a new method called fill. And when we fill, we're going to fill on the ID of new button name, which is that field's ID. And then we're going to do a test name. Once we fill that input, then when we click the button, and when we click that button, it's going to change the text on that button. So the way we're going to click the button is just like every other place, and we're going to type page click. We're just going to type our ID here of updating button. Now at this point, we've actually changed the text. And if you want to, you could assert before you change the text too, but there's no real point since that's how the page draws. But we want to make sure that the text is changed. So we're going to type assert page inner text. And then we're going to put our ID that we're looking for of the updating button, just like up above. But then we're going to set that equal to. So what this inner text will do is return that text value, and we can make sure that they match here. So if we save this, run PyTest quickly, we'll get our 2 tests because this one's commented out, but you see both of them have already passed. So PyTest makes it really easy to fill out inputs and also grab the value of text from items just by this inner text selector. The next thing we're going to test is scroll bars. So this right here is the scroll bar test. And normally this is really hard for automation frameworks because you can't see the button here. The button is somewhere over here. So you have to scroll around to get to the button, then you can click on it. This is really difficult for Selenium because locating that is just difficult. So again, I'm just going to grab a test, make sure I have my spacing right because Python really cares about that. And I'm going to change my test name here to scroll bars. And I'm going to change this to scroll bars as well. And then I'm just going to remove everything except for this click. And I'm just going to change the click to, instead of updating button, this is going to be hiding button. The next scenario we want to look at is actually the sample app. And we're going to run through a couple different login, logout scenarios. So I'm just going to go ahead and type out all these scenarios because it's basically the same thing. All right, so here we have our two tests that we're going to do. We're going to have a login fail because it's important to test that you can't just log in without being authenticated. And then we're going to test a login, logout. I'm not going to do just a test to login because that would just be a repetition with this test. Rather than just adding 2 extra lines to log out and test that it's logged out properly, I'm just going to do one login, logout test just because these tests are normally expensive. Okay, so in this menu, we can see that when we go to the sample app, we're going to fill in this input. So here we have our 2 inputs, the first one and then the second one right here. And when we hover over those, you can see this highlight in blue. And we want to select that first input based on this placeholder of username. And this is just showing here that using this XPath, grabbing the input, using the attribute of placeholder, we're going to grab that by username. So that's this section right here. And then in that input, we're just going to put the word Tim. And then we're just going to go ahead and click this login button. And then we're expecting that we just grab this text, copied it in here, and assuming that this will work. So obviously we're testing after it's been implemented, but you can assume that's our design. So that's our first test. The second test is almost the same. We're going to put in Tim, but then we're going to put in the password, and this input has a name of password. That is right here. Let me scroll over so you can see it. So there's a name of password on that input. And then we're going to put in PWD and then click the login. We're going to check that it says welcome Tim here in this text. And then the way this app works is it says fill and submit the form for successful login, use any non-empty username, and then PWD as the password. And then this button here changes to logout, even though the ID of this button still says login. So we're just going to re-hit the login button to log out. And then you should get a user logged out message. And we're just going to assert that that's the user logged out for this test. So let's go ahead and run that here. We added the ability to fill in inputs and also assert that our login and logout state was working. The next test case I want to show you is a special one, and that's this non-breaking space case. A non-breaking space is actually a space that looks like any other space. The difference is that it won't do a line break. So if you were in Word, your line, if you had to put space, a non-breaking space, it bring the second half of that word down to the next line. So here, if I go to the non-breaking space, you can see this My button that has a non-breaking space in it. If I hit F12 there and I look at it, you can see that there's this special character here. So there's this ampersand NBSP, which is the sign for non-breaking space, and then it's a semicolon. The point here is that you can write a test to still click on that button, even though it's got a breaking space. So our test for non-breaking space, go to the page, search with that button, and they must normalize white space now or something. because now if we go ahead and run this test, it's going to pass for us. At this point, we have a good amount of tests. We have quite a few examples of how you can do things with Playwright. And if we look back here, many of these are the same. These click ones are basically the same thing we've done already a number of times. These load delays are really the same thing again. We did text input, scroll. We've verified text in a number of places. And you can also do some things with progress bars. This is going to be the last test that we're going to do, but it's also probably the most interesting of the ones we're going to do. Here, you're supposed to click start, and then it's going to choose a random speed to go, and then you're supposed to click stop at 75. And then it's going to, here, put the text of how many seconds you missed that by, or if you got it right. If I click start, you'll see that this bar actually goes a super random time. It can go super fast, or it can go super slow. The point is really to stress test the automation framework and make sure that it can locate things at the correct amount of time. Back at our tests, we're going to start here with test progress bar. We're going to pass a page, and then once we have that page, we're going to go to progress bar, and then when we're at progress bar, we're going to then have to click on the start button, and we're going to find that start button based off the ID of start button. And once we find that start button, it gets a little bit more interesting, because if we hit the dev tools here and we click on this text, you can see that there's a lot of properties here, but the aria value now is the actual property that this is set to, and this value keeps updating. So before we talked about how you could use like a div and check any of the attributes. So we're going to be able to grab this div and check this aria value now and see that it's set the same. Let me refresh real quick, and you can see that the aria value now is set to 25. And if I click start, it keeps ticking up. So we're gonna use that attribute here. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna do page inner text, and we're gonna check that the progress bar has an aria value now, and then we're going to do that equal to, and now we're going to just make sure it's in single quotes since we're already inside double quotes, 75. And basically what that's going to do is it's going to sit on the page and wait for that progress bar's aria value now inner text to exist, or basically just the property to exist. We don't really care what the inner text value is. We're just waiting for that value to show up on the screen. So then we just need to click on that stop button. And once we click on that stop button, we're going to have to assert that our page result is close to 0. There is a complete chance that this test will fail intermittently. And this is going to be slightly different, but we're going to check that the inner text of the result has this result 0. This inner text of the result, if we go back and look at it, is actually all of this text right here. And we're just checking that in the first section that we get the value that we're looking for. So I'm just saying that we're going to get result 0 in that string, and it doesn't need to be the whole value, but we're going to partially match that value. The problem with this test is it's a timing issue, so if the browser's slow when the automation is going through, it could fail. The slower this test goes, the more likely it is to pass, so we'll see what happens here. This is taking a long time, so it might actually time out if it goes over 30 seconds. I think it got really close to our 20-second window, and then let me just run it again. Just because that has a random timing, it's really strange to see the test run and just take variable amounts of time, but this could happen with your APIs or anything else on your websites, where it could take different amounts of time under different amounts of load. And here, so the first time it took 26 seconds, and this time it took 19 seconds. But again, if I just comment out this progress bar test that has a really strange wait, our test runs very quickly. And right now they're only running against Chrome. We could actually switch that to make them run against Firefox and Chrome. And again, all you would have to do is something like Chromium browser. So now it's going to run double the amount of tests. So there were 6 items on Firefox and 6 items on Chromium, and they still all passed in 10 seconds. And rather than typing that every time in there, you can also type that into your PyInit. So this is where you could add that you want to use WebKit, Firefox, and Chrome. If you really want to run that every single time, you could put that in here, or you could have multiple PyTest inits that you switch between when you want to run certain settings. Like the video if you guys got value. Subscribe if you want to see more content like this. I should be doing another video with a test generator for Playwright. So if you want to see that content, subscribe and see it when it comes out.